Couch potato. That term describes us all from time to time. After all, who doesn't like to collapse in front of a TV and just take it all in? You might even be doing that right now as you watch this. But that's a 20th century term for a 20th century medium. Now, when we experience compelling content, we can actually be inspired to act on it well beyond our living rooms. We can use this form of entertainment, games, music, movies, to transform the way that we learn, lead, and conduct business. Suddenly, we've moved from being a passive audience to being part of an active and interactive community. As we'll find out from one of the most influential creators in gaming and a leading academic who's rewriting the history of popular music, it's fundamentally about bringing people together. I'm Hanson Hossein. Welcome to Four Peaks. Michelle Habell-Pallán stands at the summit of community. She's an award-winning researcher who curated the exhibition American Sabor, Latinos in Popular Music. From the Experience Music Project in Seattle to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., it has inspired a new narrative about one of America's greatest cultural exports. Michelle also directs the Women Who Rock project, which builds and strengthens relationships between musicians and educational institutions. She hopes that this dialogue sustains a participative music scene in the Pacific Northwest. Michelle, welcome.
Thank you, thank you.
You once said this, that we can curate people out of existence. When you look at your work and the history of pop music, what do you mean by that?
Well, if I was speaking specifically in that context of museum curation, so just trying to understand how we represent stories, right? The stories of rock in the U.S. usually does not include Latinos or many women. And so in that sense, when you go to an exhibit and you don't see women there or Latinos there, you're not necessarily even saying, where are they? Because in a way, we've been trained to expect not to see them there. So in that way, we've been curated out of existence.
So they've been curated out of that story.
Yeah, right.
Why do you think that happened?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think there's, particularly in American Sabor, which I co-curated with my colleagues Shannon Dudley and Marisol Berrios Miranda, and I think that we get used to listening to American music or rock and roll in a way this is a story that we hear, right? Everybody kind of knows the story of rock and roll, right? Country and Western got together with the blues, had a baby, and named it rock and roll. And you could say that's the story, but that's only part of the story. Also at that party were the rhythms and the instruments brought to the party by Latinos living in the US, right? And so really that kind of mixing of the instruments and the sounds of all these different communities is what gives us that amazing music that we have, rock and roll.
So when I think of songs like, say, Johnny Be Good, Chuck Berry, or Shake, Rattle and Roll, Jerry Lee Lewis, do we have any kind of Latino influence in that kind of music?
We can think about the rhythms. So what we do, and the way that we kind of trace that influence is through the rhythms in the exhibit. So for instance, in certain songs, we can hear the cha-cha-cha rhythm. So if we think about Louie Louie, let's just use that example.
Which is a great Pacific Northwest song, right? The Kingsmen.
So that song is actually based on a song by Rene Toussaint, who's a Cuban musician. And the original song was called El Cha-Cha Loco. And you know that song, that part that goes dun 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 dun.
You're right, that is very Latino.
Well, that was the main part of the song, right? That was played on clave. Well, this young man in Los Angeles named Richard Berry, who happened to be African American, was playing in a band with Chicanos or other Latinos in Southern California, and they had that record. And so he heard that record, and he said, "We have to do a song around that. We have to cover that record." And so they did, but they transferred that dun 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 outside of the clave, and we heard it on the guitar. So actually, that was done before the Kingsmen. So the Kingsmen heard the cover that Richard Berry and the Chicano kids did, and then they covered and made it their sound, right? So dun 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 dun, 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 dun. So you can hear it. I'm not.
I can listen to that all.
Yeah,
I keep going.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So, but there again, we're not usually thinking of that song as a Latino influenced song, but there it is. It's got the Cuban rhythms, right? It's got the cha-cha.
Is it because everything has been so mixed up, especially during those early days of rock and roll, that we don't give it the right kind of credit?
I think that when you think about who's writing the histories, they may not necessarily know the history, that backstory, or they may not necessarily care about the backstory, right? And so I think that there's a way in which the narrative needs to make sense. And the way that we make sense of rock in the US, I think, is through that black-white binary, right? That relationship between African-American communities and the European-American communities, which is a true back and forth in relationship, but there was also this other voice in there, right?
Which makes it more complicated for that simple history.
Right, and I think right now we live in a really, we're in a moment again where there is a lot of anti-immigrant hostility, or Latinos are seen as foreign, right, coming into the nation. And so what we were trying to show through, or what we were trying to allow people to hear through the music, is that we've been here, our communities have been here, and we've helped shape American culture and through the music. And so, and I think that is a really interesting way to tell a different story about what is America, who is America. It's through the music. And in that way, it becomes interactive. It becomes this dance between you and I, this dance between the larger communities. And I think people are more open if I'm dancing with you instead of pounding it.
Pounding it, yeah. and you're dancing with us through an act of curation.
Right.
So how exactly does curation help us retell the story in a more accurate way?
I think I and my partners were thinking about the act of curation as an act of intervention, so that there was a way in which, there was a spirit in which we brought to the project that was, okay, there's a status quo narrative about what is...
Which could be an addiction if you have an intervention, right?
Oh, definitely. Well, yes, definitely for music for me. So, but what I was wanted to say is there was great care brought with curation, and the word curate, it goes back to this idea of a priest, of a curate, right? And in Spanish, the word curar or el curo is a priest. So there's this idea of the curate taking care of souls, and the curator taking care of objects, but the soul of objects. So kind of wanting to be creative about that idea of what does it mean to curate? To curate is to care for. And if you have a particular point of view, if you have a particular goal in terms of we care for these communities and these stories haven't been told, then that again makes the act of curation a different act than just selecting and preserving and caring for objects. It's about telling a particular story with very deep care in order to keep alive the souls of the people who help create this music, right?
So this word curation has actually become huge in my world of content and communication. This explosion of content has made it so difficult for people to wade through all that, that they're actually looking to filtering and curation of places to go where this content is taken good care of, that they can go and actually immerse themselves in that. So when you look at the American Sabor project, how does that immersiveness and participation happen when they go see the exhibit?
Well, in our exhibit, we were very fortunate to work with the Experience Music Project, which had the technology in order to help bring the music to life within the museum exhibit. And that was through, obviously, the music and creating sound booths in which people, audiences or the community could go and listen to the songs that we had and the way that we kind of told our story about music through the songs in sound booths that allowed them to listen to the music, but that we consciously made those booths big enough for a group of people so that when people went in, it wasn't an individual experience on headphones. That's what we didn't want. We wanted people to be able to interact, to dance, and that's what happened. People would start to hug each other, and they would reminisce, and families would come in, and kids would dance with their parents to these oldies but goodies. And
so very communal then. Very communal,
very communal. And that idea of music as, again, being hardwired into us as a form of communication, right, of storytelling, and dance also as storytelling. And we also created a platform, a dance floor. We had a dance floor in the middle of the exhibit with music so that people would be inspired to dance. So we really wanted people to come and to understand the history, but to also interact with the music in ways that would enrich their experience, and then they could share with other people.
And are we talking about people who are attending and participating beyond the Latino community?
Oh, definitely, because I think that the music has influenced beyond the Latino community, and that was the story. And I think if you listen to 96 Tears, Question Mark and the Mysterians, not many people know that they were a band, a Mexican-American band, whose families had migrated from Texas up to Detroit, right? Because there was work there. There's agriculture, there was a steel industry, there was all kinds of work. So there were migrations from Texas, South Texas, up there. And at the time that the 96 Tears was a hit, right before the Vietnam War, right during the draft, there wasn't necessarily a market for brown or Latino. That didn't come into existence yet. So they were really being mysterious on purpose because they didn't necessarily fit into either market segments, whether it was
they had to bleach themselves a little bit, essentially. Yeah.
Or even, and I would argue that they didn't really bleach themselves, but they made themselves ambiguous in a way.
So nobody could sort of associate
Right.
a culture or a race particularly with
Right.
what they were doing.
And what was interesting about that song, 96 Tears, here's the hook, which is, you're gonna cry, 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 96 tears, and it goes dun 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 dun.
So there's that rhythm
Right,
again, right?
right. So
Yeah.
actually that's taken from the conjunto, the Tejano conjunto, and that was a rhythm that was pounded out or worked out on an accordion and then transferred to the keyboard because it was very common in South Texas or in the Tejano music tradition to use that electric keyboard at that time and interchange it with the accordion, which is a traditional Tejano.
So why is this more immersive physical act of going to a museum to see an exhibit and participate, why is that more effective for you than actually rewriting a history book?
I think because music itself is one thing on a page, and dancing is one thing, describing dancing is one thing on a page, but to really understand it and understand those connections, you have to feel it, you have to experience it. I think that's what I would argue.
And you're doing exactly the same thing with the Women Who Rock project. I mean, and we're talking less about history now,
Right.
and we're talking about actually recognizing the huge influence that women continue to have over rock and roll, and what has been traditionally seen until very recently as a very much a male-dominated endeavor.
Right. Well, what is wonderful about Women Who Rock is that it's a live project. So we're talking about the past and the future, the present and the future. And one of the ways that we're here in Seattle is that we can really bring attention to this idea that women have always been in music, right? But have been left out of the official narrative or curated out of the narrative, is to bring that history to the fore and then to create an oral history project, which we are in conversation with women who have been in this local Seattle scene and beyond, and taking their stories and making them available through the University of Washington, through online archive. And part of our hope and our goal and our mission is that people will listen to those stories and will understand the role that women have played. Now, when I teach or when I research about women in rock, there's that official narrative that says, well, there's nothing to teach. Women really weren't there, and if they were there, they didn't do anything of significance. But what the archive does, this oral history archive and the project does, is prove no, women were there. You can't say that women weren't there, and of course they did many significant things. And if you're not including them in the story, it's for a different reason.
And you say that this helps feed the current scene. Why is the scene in quotes? Why does that matter? Scenes.
Yeah.
Why does it matter now to actually have that in the present? I mean, what are we talking about when you say scene?
Well, I think that, as we spoke about before, this idea of the social, and we live in a moment when we have lots of opportunities maybe to connect more online or through the wires, but there's a kind of shrinking of the public sphere. And live music, in a way, is a very powerful place where we gather, right? And we share and we connect on a one-to-one basis.
So this stuff, that still matters, that connection, that physical connection still matters.
I really believe Of course, and especially in music too, because live music, because it's about the moment, what's being communicated through the performance between the audience and the performer on stage. What is interesting about the scenes that we're interested in documenting is how that relationship between the performer on stage and the community member in the audience is very fluid. So it's just not a one-way, but it's a two-way communication, in that at any moment somebody in the audience can hop on stage. So there's kind of a punk do-it-yourself ethos, a very hip-hop do-it-yourself ethos. And so we're really trying to talk about, document these histories that have been very much do-it-yourself and maybe aren't well known in the mainstream, but have really been a place where women and young women can foster creative expression.
Do it yourself and participative. I love that. So you now have heard from Jordan Weisman at the peak of entertainment and Michelle Habell-Pallan at the peak of community. When we return, we'll bridge these peaks. Together, we'll discover how you can use content to inspire deep participation.